Steve, how's it going? Like, subscribe, etc. Today I'm talking about sound design and sound in general. A simple, short guide to help give you a lot of knowledge, hopefully, on synthesis, on what you're doing when you're actually changing the quality of the timbre of the sound in your synthesizer, to hopefully help you get a lot more out of sound design with that extra level of understanding. What is sound? Sound is vibration. The number of times that something vibrates creates pitch. Our ears perceive that number of vibrations, transfers the messages to the brain, and the brain decodes that as a pitch. We hear 100 hertz, which is 100 cycles per second. If it was a string, it's 100 vibrations per second that create that pitch. Or if it was a synthesizer, it's an oscillator that creates oscillations 100 times per second. The higher the number of oscillations, the higher the pitch that we perceive. The higher the frequency, the higher the pitch. Sounds which are more complex have got multiple vibrations, but they often have that fundamental frequency that gives us the pitch of a sound. Bigger sounds, which are noise-based, don't tend to have an identifiable frequency to us anyway. You can categorize pretty much all sound as a combination of sine waves. If I use operator and we click on here as a user wave and the oscillator, and I just enable that first one, and I've got a C playing there. There we go. In the oscilloscope, you can see that is a sine wave, a nice wavy wave, like the waves on a beach of a child's drawing. If I go to the sawtooth, I'll go saw 64. That's a sawtooth wave. You can see the extra harmonics that have gone on there. If I go to a square, you'll see in the oscilloscope, these are quite noisy square waves, which are nice in a way. And likewise for triangle, we've got a triangle wave shape. Now, what every single one of those waveforms shares in common is they all use harmonics. Harmonics are a basic multiplication of the base frequency, the fundamental. So the fundamental is what we call, it's generally the lowest frequency. So in this case, if I go back to a user wave, the fundamental here is C1. Now, if I add the next harmonic, that is actually C2. So the multiplication is times 2. The next harmonic is times 3. Now, we're working in sort of subdivisions, you can see, of hertz, 67.2, 66.5. If we take it to its most basic, easiest way to understand is if our first fundamental frequency is 100 hertz, times 2 is 200 hertz, times 3, 100 times 3 is 300 hertz. 100 times 4 is 400 hertz. Now, these are not all octaves, these are different subdivisions. So if we go the multiplication here, we start off with a C, times 2 is an octave up, C, because it's a doubling of the frequency. Every time you double the frequency of a sound, you get an octave. So times 2 is an octave, times 4 is an octave, and then times 8 is an octave. So we add the next in the sequence, we've got a G, and again we go to a C, then we go to an E, and we go to a G, then we go to an A sharp, and we are back to a C. And that sequence, if I add all of these, goes up. Now, these are harmonics. There's two things, harmonics and overtone. An overtone is anything above the fundamental. A harmonic is a specific relationship to the fundamental, and harmonics are what you're dealing with in pretty much all the synthesis you're going to find. There's some ways which I'll cover in a little bit, but pretty much everything you look at is using harmonics. Let's look at distortion. You have here, pretty much all distortion is actually harmonic, and I'll show you. We have the wavetable, and this just has a sine wave. Again, the basic building block of sound. If I change the filter type, you won't see anything immediately apart from with PRD. PRD filter, you can see just a little bit there on the frequency spectrum. So let's go to OSR and let's up the drive. All of a sudden, we have these harmonics appear. Now we've got that bass note of C. Let's go to the top of that. That's the C. Again, that's the harmonic series. That's the G. that's the C, so on and so forth. The difference you get in the timbre, the quality of the sound that you hear, is the different volume of each harmonic. If I change the OSR to an MS2, you can see we are still getting the same harmonics, however they're just changing in amplitude or volume. And finally with the PRD. PRD is a much cleaner sounding filter, it's got less volume in the harmonics. Now I also have, I'm going to put the output down, a saturator. If I turn those filters off, you can see, there's me C. We don't have the octave on that though, we've skipped that and we're going to the G, and that's with the sinoid fold with the drive turned right up. If I change that to analog clip, look at that, we've got the same pattern in it. Soft sine. Experiment and have a little play around with that and you'll find all of these things that add the sound and character and quality that are actually using harmonics. Let's look now at the 4 main types of synthesis. There are a lot more, there's different ways of doing things, but these are the 4 principal types. So Wavetable, this is a relatively new thing, obviously Serum from Xfer, that is a big Wavetable synth that really sort of launched Wavetable at the big time. This is the Ableton Wavetable. Let's play that C again. Now what a wavetable allows you to do is to cycle between waveforms. I've got sine wave, triangle, notice the harmonics again, and I can cycle between them and have a little bit of that. And if I go triangle to sawtooth, that morphing between the 2 waveforms, you can see the harmonics changing above it, and again to the sine wave. And you can see in the oscilloscope the 4 waves there are actually perfectly represented. A great thing about Wavetable is you can take any type of complex waveform, so let's go filter, and look at that again, harmonics. But we can swipe, every time we're switching around the wavetable we get a different level of harmonics from the fundamental frequency that creates that sound that you actually hear. No matter what sound I go to on the wavetable, pretty much all harmonic. Got our fundamental, there's the first harmonic, there's the next harmonic, but they're all at different levels, which creates that timbre of the sound. So with wavetable, you can sweep through and see those harmonics changing in the wavetable as you sweep. Subtractive synthesis is basically starting with a harmonically rich waveform and using filters to remove parts of the wave. So if I take for example this swept noise waveform, this is our bass note, but you can see the harmonics are all over the place, so we've still got that fundamental giving us the frequency, but it's more through the combination of the harmonics that we actually get the frequency sound. So if I remove from the top end, I'm quietening that sound, and if I use a notched filter, I'm taking out the middle of the sound. You can take the resonance to make the notch a little bit smaller. And then up that to actually hear it. You can see in the oscilloscope we're just pretty much dealing with a noise waveform there. But that in a nutshell is subtractive synthesis. You're taking away from it to create a darker or nicer, pleasant sounding thing. Additive synthesis is basically using sine waves to create a sound, so we're just adding more and more sine waves each time. Now we did that before earlier on, where we start off with 1 sine wave and we're adding all the extra ones up there. That is additive synthesis. However, to do that properly, you're talking about adding an awful lot of sine waves. For example, here we go with 4 sine waves. We've got the fundamental, plus 12, plus 19, plus 24 semitones, and that gives us the first 4 harmonics. Now, to actually create sound and make any sound you want to, you can imagine it takes an awful lot of those sine waves. Just imagine how many of these I would have to have stacked amongst each other to create complex sounds. So you start getting into very, very complicated territory, and you need an awful lot of CPU to actually process additive synthesis to any great degree. So there's not an awful lot of additive synthesizers out there because of the constraints. But what we can do with additive is we can move out of the harmonics. So we can say 4 semitones with that. Let's do that at 8. Let's do that at 9. Let's duplicate that, and we'll do this one at 15. Now that isn't very pleasant. And that's the thing with the additive synthesis, it can be a little bit jarring to the ear. You've got to put in a lot more effort to actually get your sounds out of it when you move away from the harmonics. And the fourth form of synthesis is FM, frequency modulation. I've just knocked the bottom end off the EQ8 here because it can get a little bit messy. So the operator is Ableton's FM synthesizer. And what you do with operator is you have, this is the basic algorithm. They've got different ways of interacting with each other. This is that feeds into that, feeds to that, feeds to that. So they all modulate each other. So if I start turning this one up, that is a sine wave, that's a sine wave, but they're interfering with each other, frequency modulation. So if I turn this sine wave up now, start interfering even more, and this sine wave even more. Now if we actually change the waves, we go with square 16, you'll see how they're interfering even more there and creating some interesting things on the oscilloscope as well. We'll put that to a square 4, we'll change this to so 16. But the one thing remains, they are all harmonics, they're just at different levels. Now what we can do with FM is we can detune these oscillators, and it starts getting a little bit messy, and then you've got to be kind of careful with the sound and how you do it. So if I use the fine tuning here, I'll go here. Now we've really moved out of a sort of identifiable sound. So what is our fundamental here? Technically it's still the C1, but you've got a lot going on underneath it now because of what we've done with the fine tuning. And because sound is a series of oscillations, vibrations, they're all vibrating and interfering with each other due to the FM synthesis and due to the pitches that we've got. So the thing with FM is you've got to put in quite a lot of work sometimes to get really good quality usable sounds. You can play around with it and just get absolute mush and you don't know what's going on. If I change the algorithm there to this one, which means that none of them are interfering with each other, they're only playing alongside and mixing with each other, we retain that fundamental and we have some really weird things going on above it with the overtones. Overtones because they're not harmonically related, because we're using the fine tuning. So we get fairly weird and wonderful with FM. It's a world you really should explore. Thank you very much. That's everything. I hope that this has helped you out. I hope it's demystified, and I hope it hasn't just sort of mashed your brain. Because I think that's the thing with synthesis. Sometimes it can just totally confuse the hell out of you. Let us know if you want us to do any more on this, because I'd be happy to expand on it and kind of get deeper into synthesis as well. Because I absolutely love sound design. It's a load of fun. Thanks very much. Like, subscribe again, etc. See you later. Goodbye.